Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session. Today, I am super excited to be able to present to you a couple of panels and a couple of discussions about some really exciting research. In case you're wondering if you're in the right room, this is session 5.2, which is called Solidarity and Accountability. Today, we'll be hosting two different presentations. And instead of me reading the bios, I'll just very briefly tell you who we're presenting. And if you want more information, you can go through the portal to find the speaker profile, and you can learn more about each of our speakers. So without further ado, knowing that our time is really precious, Connal Lee is an ethicist and health philosopher based at the University of South Australia down in Adelaide. And he has a really interesting background covering a really wide range of different specialties, but most recently on pandemic ethics, which I know is something really that's on all of our minds, looking at distribution of scarce resources and tying that in with art experience and well-being promotion. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So I'll hand over to Connal now, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Just a reminder to drop your questions in the chat room so that we can bring those together. We'll have a few minutes after each speaker to answer questions from our audience. And then at the end, we'll have another 15-20 minutes to have a nice discussion.
Fantastic. So my hope today in looking at this notion of solidarity in relation to vulnerable stigmatized groups is to provide not only a sketch of the philosophical considerations, but also to bring some clarity to the notion of solidarity, and to also provide, I hope, some practical implications for thinking about solidarity, and also building on the previous session that looked at storytelling, some good relationships to that there. So the starting point for this came at the start of 2020, after the COVID outbreak. The World Health Organization issued something of a directive to individuals and nations across the world to foster a climate of solidarity, not stigmatization. Now, a lot of good work has been done in the area of stigmatization. We kind of understand quite a lot about the pathological elements of stigmatization. However, it piqued my philosophical interest to see this notion of solidarity and to try and unpack it a little bit, because it's not just the antithesis, say, of something like stigmatization. So what exactly do we mean by solidarity? Is it something of almost a political kind of concept related more to trade unionism? Or is it something that we can talk about meaningfully in public health ethics, and in this context of global justice, perhaps? Today, I'm hoping as well to provide some explanation around how solidarity relates to this question of who are the humanitarians, to try and shed a bit of light on that, particularly around what individuals can be doing in this context, perhaps rather than focusing on institutions. But part of what I'll talk about will be about individuals influencing institutions. So some working definitions to start with, a bit of a sketch of the literature, found a few different ideas popping up when we talk about solidarity. So the first was this idea of standing together, and the idea that solidarity could be thought of as synonymous with standing with some sort of collective or group. And the idea here is that collective action seems to be preferable when, for example, meeting a threat or an emergency, that individuals are better off working with others rather than, say, standing alone or acting out of perhaps narrow self-interest or something like this. So this first idea that came up was this rather sort of clear idea of solidarity as standing with others. A more concrete definition came from Prainsack and Bayou's work, and they looked at solidarity as a willingness to carry the costs and burdens associated with helping those who are in need and those who are most vulnerable to harm. Now, I thought that this definition provided something that we can sort of work with a little bit, and it's probably one of the better working definitions. Although I want to look at some of the issues surrounding this idea of protecting the vulnerable within it. So the basic idea here is that solidarity is about standing with other people to meet some sort of threat or emergency or collective goal. But part of that entails a commitment to look after those people who are the most vulnerable amongst us, whether that be domestically or globally. So solidarity, in part, it seems, stems from seeing in other people our own potential to be in need or our own potential for vulnerability. It sort of starts from the premise that no person is invulnerable and that vulnerability is kind of something that links humanity together, that we are all capable of being rendered vulnerable to harm in some way. So part of Prainsack and Bayou's definition is that solidarity stems from a sense of sameness, okay? Now they point out with their famous gambler example that it might be difficult to express this solidarity with all vulnerable groups, that this sense of sameness might be difficult when it comes to people whose experiences of the world are quite different to our own experiences of the world. So somebody who is vulnerable to the harms that arise from, say, a gambling addiction might be difficult for people who have never gambled or don't understand that particular compulsion to develop, say, empathy with or solidarity with. Now, I think we can safely call that a kind of a vulnerable stigmatized group, a group that's not only vulnerable but is subject to stigmatization. I think an even more acute example of this could be prisoners in the context of the COVID outbreak. Prisoners are vulnerable to becoming infected because overcrowding, close living arrangements in correctional facilities, and the amounts of people who are all incarcerated at one time can lead to acute spread of a disease. There's also the existing ill health within the prison population, data showing that respiratory illness, for example, tuberculosis, can spread can actually have quite a negative impact on people in the correctional facilities due to their existing ill health. So they're very much a stigmatized and vulnerable group. And of course, we can imagine that the average law-abiding citizen might have difficulty with the idea of expressing solidarity with vulnerable prisoners in the context of something like COVID. So I'm going to suggest today that there might be a way of moving with this, and it might lie in the idea of moral imagination. Now, moral imagination is about going beyond the normative ethical principles. So this might be the rights-based deontological theories or theories associated with consequentialism and utilitarianism, or the principles of ethics, for example, respect for autonomy or promoting beneficence, these kind of things. It's about moving away from these kind of analytic theoretical devices while still recognizing their importance, and thinking about and utilizing creative modes or creative models for thinking. And part of this is about looking at the stories and the narratives, or what has often been referred to as the lived experience or the lived experiences of stakeholders, of individuals and groups. And I'm going to tentatively suggest that the idea of moral imagination might offer a way of approaching that gambler problem that Prainsack and Bayou raise. I want to talk about moral imagination in both a general and specific sense. So the specific sense in which we might talk about moral imagination is a willingness to seek out and listen to the stories of vulnerable groups. Now, we have to accept that this will differ from person to person. It is about a willingness, and some people might be more willing than others to go and seek out and listen to stories. And it might differ from context to context. So some vulnerable stigmatized groups might be particularly difficult for people to express empathy with. Prisoners who are guilty of heinous crimes, for example, could be particularly hard to have empathy or sympathy for. Now, the idea with a specific sense of moral imagination is to search out specific stories, okay? To look for specific narratives that deal with these particular individuals. So I think a classic example of this is the ways in which reading a book by Charles Dickens will alert somebody to an understanding around social injustice, for example, or seeking out a news story about Palestine will, for example, give you a deeper insight into the humanitarian crisis going on there. Now, a lot of this stems from a famous quote from philosopher Thomas Nagel, who said that there's something that it's like to be a bat in the philosophy of consciousness. And it's this idea that there's something that it's like to be the conscious creature that we know as a bat. And but we can't really imagine what that is exactly like from our paradigm as human beings. We can imagine being hairy, having strange skin, staying up all night and eating fruit, but we can't actually imagine the exact precision of what it would be like to be a bat or to have batness, for example. We can only imagine what it's like to be a bat as a human, imagining what it's like to be a bat. And perhaps we could say that the experience of people in the world, of vulnerable, stigmatized individuals, is a little bit like this, that it's something that can't be reduced. We can't actually walk in the shoes of people who are experiencing life as a vulnerable, stigmatized individual. Okay. But this doesn't mean that we can't express solidarity with them. The fact that we can't, see the world through their eyes necessarily doesn't mean that we can't stand with them in some sense. Bearing in mind, of course, that the point of solidarity is that there's some sort of shared goal, and that we should be able to stand with people who have different backgrounds, different values, and different experiences of the world. There is also, and this is where I'm becoming more interested in my own research, the more general sense of moral imagination. And this idea is that we can develop our abilities to do creative ethical thinking by engaging with stories and narratives and even just creative models, more broadly construed. And I take my lead here from Martha Norsbaum's work on the idea of literature being something that can help us develop our empathy. And it's the idea that engaging with stories, engaging with narratives, reading books, watching films, hearing other stories, oral histories, whatever they might be, that these things, even if they don't have an acute moral angle, can still help us to develop our empathy muscles, so to speak. And Norsbaum kind of suggests that it's a little bit like exercising our empathy muscles just to do general engagement with creative works. So we get a question about whether or not regularly engaging with stories is a good way to develop our moral imagination, even if they're not acute moral tales, even if they're not, for example, Dickensian stories of injustice that highlight the plight of the poor. I'd like to give an example of how we kind of can do this as a part of a broader agenda for teaching ethics and perhaps even teaching people to be humanitarian in their thinking and to develop the humanitarian side of their brain. Is to physiotherapists. We get the students to actually write narratives of the stakeholders. So as part of their stakeholder analysis, they don't just identify who the various interests are and what those interests might be, but we actually explore hypothetical stories associated with those characters. So even though we're doing it from our standpoint, from our paradigm and looking at the characters hypothetically, what we do is we delve into their possible storylines. So we can imagine with that example of the vulnerable stigmatized prisoners, that by writing a character narrative that explores that point of view, we might help to address our own assumptions, identify our own assumptions, and to perhaps even break down some of our more judgmental ways of thinking about these characters and these individuals and groups. We might even explore possible explanations and perhaps even justifications for why people end up in particular situations. So we end up with a kind of a question about humanitarians and humanitarianism, engaging moral imagination in both this specific and general sense. So what we're left with, I think, is something about moving away from solidarity as a feeling and moving towards solidarity as an action that's responsibility-based. Something that encourages us to engage our moral imagination in a variety of ways, in both general and specific ways, and to do what we can, I suppose, as individuals to address humanitarian needs. So actively supporting measures, perhaps doing what we can to contribute, perhaps joining or even creating capable collectives. The point being that if we engage our moral imagination, we might be more likely to do these things, more likely to build on and recognise our duties and responsibilities. I'd like to end by floating some possible bigger questions that a commitment to solidarity in the area of humanitarianism raises. And if I'm onto something, which I hope I am, we need to think about access to social resources as well. We need to think about access to the means that enable us to develop our moral imagination, to access stories, to be literate, to be able to get into public libraries, to be able to connect with each other so that we're not just thinking about moral imagination as something we develop through literature, but also through storytelling generally. And it might even raise further questions that I think are worthwhile to explore about other ways in which we might develop our moral imagination and our creative ethical thinking through engaging with other art forms and other ways of being creative and not purely analytic in our thinking about ethics and humanitarianism. Thank you.
Connal, thank you so much for this talk. I think a lot of us in the humanitarian space probably wonder often why we feel compelled to work in the places we work. And I know I've spent many long nights in very bizarre places around the world wondering, why am I doing this? And sometimes it seems like it's a very lonely pursuit. So I do think there's a whole wealth of research that should be collected on what compels some people to act and others to not act. And I think this concept of moral imagination is a really important framework that you've proposed. I also think that this has come up quite a lot in global discourse, really something tied to us living in the information age, if you will. I wonder frequently, I worked quite a long time on the Syria response, for example, and we had moments in the Syria crisis over the last decade where there would be a photograph that surfaced and suddenly the world felt compelled for about 2 to 3 news cycles, maybe a week if we were lucky. And then it sort of passed from the imagination. So there was quite a lot of talk about how to spark empathy, how to spark or train people or teach people this concept. There's a question that's popped up here in the chat that I think is really interesting for you to consider. It basically says, it's from Thomas, who says, solidarity within power imbalances seems like a subjective notion. How can we systematically and structurally square away the fact that one person's projected solidarity can be perceived as an unequal offer? And you sort of touched on this toward the end, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, solidarity is, I mean, it's kind of complex. And I think that it's hard to pull it apart from talking about protecting the vulnerable, I think it's hard to pull it apart from this commitment to do what we can to help people who are in need, and this idea that we should be committed to not only have feelings about injustice or whatever it might be, but to actually support measures that address this. And I think we're always going to be dealing with layers of vulnerability. rather than sort of labels of vulnerability. We're all vulnerable in different ways, and we're all, there's degrees to which we can be, rendered vulnerable and be put into a position of harm. So I think that that's true, that we sort of have to consider all the sort of asymmetries that are involved, and I think there's always going to be inequalities and disparities between who's vulnerable to what, and weighing these things up can be quite difficult. I wanted to touch back to your initial point as well about the Syria example and the news cycles, because I think that's very important. And that's why I want to highlight that general sense in which we might be developing our moral imagination, and to think of it as something that's an ongoing process, rather than just something that we do in a specific sense. So, for example, tuning in and watching a story about what's happening in Palestine or what's happening in Syria, it's obviously an important thing and it can provide us with specific information. But in terms of kind of flexing our empathy muscles and working out regularly, we need to be engaging in an ongoing basis with stories and with our creative modes of thinking. So like, the empathy part of our brain is a muscle like kind of any muscle, and it needs to be worked out, and kept fit, if you will.
Excellent. So many more questions are popping up.
Okay.
It did strike me quite a lot when you mentioned this toward the beginning of your talk, that we are all capable of being rendered vulnerable. And I think there's something really important that we should wrestle with on that as well. I'll come back to the other questions that have popped up in the chat when we circle back for a discussion at the end. I'll let you think about these though while the others are talking. This idea of how virtual reality, people are trying to use this for the purpose to let people step into another world, gaming, those kinds of things. And I think you'll have some thoughts on the value of virtual reality versus access to the other tools you mentioned, like libraries and literature. So maybe you could reflect on that a bit, and then we'll circle back.
Fantastic.
Sound good? Great. So we'll circle back to those questions.